Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. And I want to welcome you to the third episode of the second season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversation and interventions in the fields of religion and American studies. The second episode of this season was a dynamic and thought-provoking discussion on religion and disability, where we discussed both scholarly and practical implications of disability and disability theory. We continue to ask questions this year from the perspective of scholars and the implications for all of our guilds, as well as the implications in applied and practical settings. It is so exciting to see our audience grow to include scholars, university staff members, chaplains, practitioners, and concerned community members from around the country. I want to remind you that you can return to episodes from the beginning of this year and from last season, and you are more than welcome to use these resources in your classrooms and in your community spaces. All of the episodes and the clips are available on YouTube and on the Center's website. I want to thank the scholars who took time out of their schedules last month to provide nuanced and engaging discussions to challenge the fields of religion and American studies. So thank you, Meredith Rose, Kenzie Mentis, Sarah Emhoff, and Dan Bowman from last month. Today, our conversation is on religion and conspiracy. Religious participation in conspiracy theories has received increased attention in both scholarship and public discourse lately. And as a result, a number of key questions have emerged that our panelists are going to engage today. Why are some worldviews described as conspiratorial when others are seen as rational, or at least not threatening to the state or the public domain? Are conspiracy theories in the body politic a problem to be solved, as well as a phenomenon to be understood? And how do we engage and think across these topics in the fields of religious studies and American studies? So we have pulled together a discussion that will examine these questions and others in light of what many argue is a recent intensification of the connection between religion and conspiracy theories, particularly in the United States, but as you will learn as I introduce our hosts and panelists across the world, this is a topic that needs to be engaged and discussed. So I want to just remind folks that as we are working today, throughout today's session, we're asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. So you can see that there's a Q&A feature. So if you want to submit questions, please do it there. The host and the panelists will be able to engage those questions as they facilitate this important conversation. The chat feature will be open, but if you want to have a question answered, please submit it through the Q&A feature. Now let me introduce the host for today's conversation. First, I want to introduce Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University. She has a PhD in social cultural anthropology from New York University, and her research focuses on conservative politics, race, media worlds, evangelicals, and Orthodox Christianity. Her forthcoming book from Fordham University Press is Between Heaven and Russia: Religious Conversion and Political Apostasy in Appalachia. I can't wait to read that. Really, Sarah, I'm so excited and so eager to have you on our panel today. Our other host for this afternoon is Rob Saylor, who is the Associate Dean and Research Professor of Religion and Culture at the Christian Theological Seminary right here, where I'm located in Indianapolis, Indiana. He's also the director of the Center for Pastoral Excellence and the Lilly Endowment Clergy Renewal Program. Rob has written across a number of topics. One of his latest books, which I'm excited about, and that just shows his ability to bring together a number of different topics, is All These Things into Position: What Theology Can Learn from Radiohead, right? That's one of his latest books. And then he's also Sounding the Sacred is a co-edited volume that he just put together as well. And so I'm so excited to have Rob and Sarah come together and to bring to us this fascinating conversation on religion and conspiracy. And they will introduce our other panelists as they engage in this very important and timely discussion. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone else who's joining us this afternoon. Let's talk.
Thanks so much, Joseph, for that lovely and just generous and gracious introduction for both of us. We are so pleased to have you all with us today, and we are especially grateful to have Candace Rondeau and David Robertson with us for this conversation. Candace is a professor of practice at the School of Politics and Global Studies and a senior fellow with the Center on the Future of War at Arizona State University. Previously, she was a senior program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she launched the Resolve Network, a global research consortium on conflict and violent extremism. Candace was also a strategic advisor to the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Among numerous other jobs and accolades, she's an expert on U.S. and international security affairs, an award-winning journalist, and a frequent guest analyst on news outlets. David Robertson is a lecturer in religious studies at the Open University, the founder of the incredible and innovative Religious Studies Project podcast and website, and co-editor of the journal Implicit Religion. His work applies critical theory to the study of alternative and emerging religions and to conspiracy theory narratives. So welcome to you both. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
So I want to sort of launch us into the deep end of the pool, as it were. We know that conspiracy theories aren't new. They've been around a very long time. And yet in recent years, it seems like they've become more powerful or had more public traction. And this is in large part, I think, probably due to the digitization of our world and the interconnectedness of social media. It often feels like there's a conspiracy around every corner. So let's start with the basics. How are we defining conspiracy theories? What feeds conspiracy theories or mobilizes them, and how do they work in our society?
Who would you like to answer that?
Jump in, whoever would like to.
Whoever's brave enough.
It's a large question, I know, right? It's probably the hardest question, but we should probably get it out of the way first.
David, it seems like it's your jam.
Yeah, okay. I was trying to get you to do it, maybe. Right. So we've got these two terms then that people have been trying to define for religion longer, for a long time. Religion, conspiracy theories, they are both terms that we all kind of think we know what they mean. We know them when we see them, but the more you sort of pick at them, any kind of substantive definition kind of melts away. Conspiracy theories certainly aren't theories that posit a conspiracy. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing, conspiracies happen, right? Political conspiracies happen all the time. Sometimes people will present them as being ideas which are necessarily irrational or necessarily wrong. That also is not really the case. We can certainly find examples that are irrational and wrong, but they're, one end of a spectrum. There's also the fact that conspiracy theory as a category kind of keeps a sense of it being irrational by anytime anything turns out to be true, it's no longer a conspiracy theory. So that keeps that category rolling along. So there's a sense of it being an irrational kind of idea about agency. Usually there are certainly conspirators. Okay, so there are people who are trying to do something, and they're trying to do it covertly, usually, typically working towards some sort of plan. And anything beyond that, we start to get into a little bit more of murky waters, I think. Candace, what would you say?
Yeah, I was thinking, you have the two words, conspiracy and theory, and if you focus on theory, what's in the context of conspiracy theories, one of the things that kind of jumps out is that it is potentially, a set of hypotheses about how phenomenon fit together or events fit together, or even how individuals might cooperate or collaborate together for a particular end. But what makes those hypotheses distinct from, say, some sort of scientific set of hypotheses that you can test empirically is that they're relatively untestable and unverifiable, either because there's not enough information, the information is hidden. So going back to that sort of secret quality that you just alluded to, or because the logic of the hypotheses defies the idea of evidence itself, right? And so I think when we think about conspiracy theories, we're really not alluding just to conspiracy in the kind of common sense where individuals conspire or get together and collaborate on a particular goal. That's certainly in the, let's say in the criminal context of criminal law, that's a very defined territory. But in the context of religion or thought or ideology or epistemology, what we're really talking about is casting about for a set of ways to explain phenomenon and events without really having the tools or the logic available to verify through evidence, in fact, that those theories could be real.
And here's an interesting thing. When we almost always, when we talk about conspiracy theories, we immediately start talking about scientific verification and lacking evidence and things. Now, of course, there are many, many different explanatory frameworks that we use all the time, which similarly are difficult to disprove or we have accepted without empirical evidence. And for a conversation about conspiracy theories in religion, this is quite a pertinent point, that this seems to be presented as a distinguishing feature, which it is, I suppose, if you compare it only with a certain sort of way of viewing the world. But actually, people are much more complicated than that. And so there's another important sense is, I think, is that they are also narratives which are contrary to official narratives or hegemonic narratives or sort of accepted narratives. They're typically counter to that. They kind of challenge certain taken for granted things, right?
Right. I mean, they're counterfactual by nature, right? And embedded in the counterfactual is you've got to prove something that may or may not be true, right? Embedded in that is sort of, well, the sky is in fact blue, but the counterfactual theory is potentially that maybe it's black. Right?
So would
you're trying to prove a negative, basically.
Would that God made the sky, would that be counterfactual?
That's an interesting question.
Conspiracy narratives, the counterfactuality of them is part of it, but it's not the only thing. They're also counter to certain things that we accept, right?
Right. I mean, they're counterfactual to consensus views.
80% of Americans, identify as Christian, so that is a widespread view which is not empirically provable and which isn't regarded as a conspiracy theory. So this is what I'm saying, that there's slightly more going on than simply something being counterfactual or not a fact. The idea that most of people base their experience of reality on scientific facts is I think a simplification that we sometimes fall into when we're talking about conspiracy theories that we don't fall into as much when we're talking about other things that we're much more used to talking about. We're used to talking about religious ideas and we treat them in quite a different way. Which is, of course, religion is almost as difficult to define as conspiracy theories. I'm just pointing to this these are categories which have a really complicated relationship to truth and fact. They're not as straightforward as we would like them to be, I think.
And I think that's one of the reasons why religion scholars have been so drawn to the study of conspiracy theory, is that religion scholars are very used to the idea that epistemology, how we know things, how we either verify or falsify things, it is tied up to a certain extent, not only with questions of authority, but with questions of power. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's natural for these inquiries to be joined precisely along the lines that are being suggested. Sarah, what do you think?
I think what strikes me is that, at least from my vantage point, when I think about conspiracy theories, and I've come across a wide swath of them working with far right Orthodox people, is that they're at their core, they're world building projects, right? They're creating a world to sustain these illogical logics and these counterfactual claims. And holding them in tension in this project of creating a world where people can believe what they want. So they can believe that the sky is black, even if nature, the laws of nature suggest that it's not. And so I think that if we interrogate it through a framework that allows us to understand it as a project, rather than, sometimes I think trying to ask what the definition of a term is too problematic to begin with, right? But if we think about it as a project that ties together issues of power and issues of science and issues of spirituality and philosophy, then we can come to a little bit more different understanding of it. Sort of like walking in the side door of the theater rather than the front door.
Well, I think that raises some really interesting implications, not only if we move away from the strict definition project and we move over to, say, the rhetorical function of this term. What are we doing and what are we trying to bring about when we label something a conspiracy theory? I wonder if we could talk about what's at stake there. A number of scholars on this topic, for instance, talk about, say, 9/11. If we were to say 9/11 conspiracy, in many people's mind, that immediately moves to something like the 9/11 truther movement, and it doesn't automatically move, I think, David and Candace, as you both are saying, to the fact that there was a conspiracy clearly on 9/11. People conspired to commit a crime. So what is the rhetorical function of calling something a conspiracy theory? And just as a heads up, my follow-up will be, and should we then continue to use it? Is that term even helpful or not? Any thoughts on that? David, can we go to you?
Okay, I was gonna let Candace take this one. Yeah, okay, so I think that the function, I think, is to do with, you've kind of alluded to it already. It's to do with power, and it's to do with knowledge. It's to do with ideas which are allowed and ideas which aren't allowed. I'm a scholar of religion. I'm very used to avoiding the question of which ones are true and which ones aren't. That's part of my stock in trade. I wouldn't get very far if I jumped in and started telling one or other religious group that they were right or wrong. But in terms of conspiracy theory, I mean, to go back to the 9/11, there's the George Bush's quote, I think it was the 12th or the 13th, where he said, let us not tolerate irrational conspiracy theories. So that was immediately there, the connection with conspiracy theories and being irrational, and that we must not tolerate them. We mustn't think these are not things that should even be part of the discourse. Okay, we shouldn't be debating them. We shouldn't tolerate them. And that underlines really, for me, kind of the function of them, that these are ideas which are beyond the pale. There's quite a few scholars who talk about the kind of class dimensions of this, that these are subaltern narratives. They are, and ironically, of course, it's mirrored in the fact that they're constantly talking about elites and educated classes and all the rest of it. But they are they are popular narratives. They're populist narratives. They're also popular narratives. They're narratives which are circulating amongst ordinary people, which aren't kind of, generally speaking, aren't subjected to the kind of academic rigor that a lot of, the more sort of reliable scientific work, journalistic work, and so on would be. Sometimes, though, they do. Sometimes they become accepted or slightly more respected. Not often, but it does happen. But these categories like religion, conspiracy theory, paranormal, supernatural, these are other ones which sort of separate certain sets of ideas out and delineate kind of where you're allowed to use them, what you're allowed to say in different contexts. Yeah, that's enough for just now.
Yeah,
Candace, what do you think?
I'm meditating and sort of reflecting on what you're saying, David, and thinking about one, you mentioned rationality and irrationality, which situates the whole concept of conspiracy theories very firmly in the Enlightenment conception, right, of the rational and irrational.
Yeah.
In which, of course, our ideas about empiricism really begin, right, in the 1700s, right? So that's where it sits. I think, if we're doing a history of rhetoric, that's where the concept sits, somewhere in that era. And it has evolved with human technology, the application of human technology and communication. In the same way that there were conspiracy theories, right? Pre-Gutenberg, pre-printed book en masse, but perhaps there wasn't you can't point to a historical tradition there where we said that was an era when people were talking about conspiracy theories. But I think from the Enlightenment forward, you can. So that's one important sort of feature when we're talking about some of the where this idea rhetorically is situated. And you touched on something that I think is really interesting, especially when we talk about, especially today's conspiracy theories as we understand them, and as we are experiencing them, particularly in the United States, whether it's QAnon or COVID conspiracies or whatever they are. I think one of the things that jumps out, especially at people who kind of look at this through the lens of communications, media, and technology, which is kind of where I sort of sit in the world. There's two ways to think about misinformation and disinformation that stems from conspiracy theories. And one is that it's a group of people who are uneducated and they just need the facts, right? But another, which I think is actually very compelling, and I think there's a lot of evidence to show this when you look at the spread of conspiracy theories online in particular, that this is a world building project, as Sarah said. It is always a world building project. And in fact, it's conspiracy theories are often an attempt to kind of recover agency and also take agency away from elites.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's something in that. So part of the project isn't just world building and painting a picture of what the world really looks like, whether the sky is black versus blue. It's also that we're doing this together, and this is our recovery of power and our recovery of agency over circumstances that in our individual lives and in our communities make us feel disempowered.
That's fascinating. And I think actually you can even tie the two different points you made there into one narrative, where we see the kind of the earliest conspiracy theory, what we would now call conspiracy theories that we have on record is, around the time of the French Revolution. This is not long after the printing press comes out. And with the printing press, what you get is the first, cheap mass market communication. You get pamphlets and tracts circulating, and it's these ideas about the Illuminati and the Freemasons being behind the revolution, and then the next time you see a big uptick in conspiracy theories in the mass media is around the time, News 24, 24-hour news cycles and 24-hour talk radio and things like that. And then again, with the internet, the current sort of blooming is, again, as we move to Web 2.0, the ability for anyone to communicate any idea and undertake these world building projects has never been easier, and people are doing it. And so this is, as you say, it is an attempt to take back power from elites and build new worlds for themselves. And that's one reason that I am always pushing this angle, that attempts to understand conspiracy theories, which only come from this angle of, that it's uneducated people and it's lacking evidence and these are irrational and, dangerous ideas. They're always coming from elite positions of power, political and epistemic power. And so it's important to bear that angle in mind, I think.
I would just two-finger, if I could, just you skipped two important eras in that technology timeline that you just stated, which is the advent of radio, which coincided, I would note, with the rise of fascism around the world, but in particular in Europe. And then, of course, television, which coincided with the beginning of the Cold War. And there, in each case, there's like this kind of fever pitch around who is behind the disempowering of the good masses, the ordinary folk.
And maybe we could also see in that each time that happens, we also see more pushback from those elites who are seeing a little bit of their unchallenged hegemony dissolving away, and hence the rhetoric between good thinking and conspiracy theories becomes a little bit more polarized.
That's fascinating, David. And I wonder, in light of that, it's a great comment. I wonder, in light of that, what you think about the emphasis, and I don't know if this is the same in the UK, but the emphasis in the United States, often with journalists and those in media outlets, is to look at something like QAnon and call it a religion, right? People are saying, oh, this is a sort of a religion that people are joining, and they're adhering to these sets of doctrines, and they have a sort of messianic figurehead, and there's a lot of mysticism, right? So what do we make of that?
Well, that's very real, and it's quite intentional in the kind of, we have to be pretty clear about QAnon's origins, and maybe that's worth unpacking a little bit. This is a world building project that appeared on an image board, an internet image board, known as 4chan, first, in the form of anonymous posts about aberrant government behavior that was opposed to the ordinary folk. So you had FBI anon, you had CIA anon, very different attempts, disparate attempts to kind of get the conversation started around this idea that the government, the United States government, was in some way distorting and polluting the world with its own actions, right? And undercutting, of course, the ordinary folk. And this moment in time arrives not in 2016. We might think that, but actually it really predates 2016 with a lot of different image board controversies between video gamers and voluntary celibates. But they're in this little environment, the first 4chan and then 8chan, which is kind of the 4chan baby. It's there that Q, right, the mysterious anonymous government intelligence agent and or servant of a secret group who has elevated Donald Trump to be the next president for life, although that's not explicitly stated. Donald Trump figures obviously as the kind of savior and the messianic figure at the center of a lot of the thinking. But the first post that expressly mentions QAnon and then this worldview appears in October of 2017. Okay, so it's a year after Donald Trump has taken office, almost, or I should say, been elected to the presidency, and it coincides with a very contentious period in American politics, in which the president's national security advisor, Michael Flynn, is accused of conspiring with Russia. Right? There are conspiracy theories about his collusion and the collusion of the Trump White House with Russia and Vladimir Putin to somehow take over elections. So that's the origin story. So it's really important to keep that in mind. But the timing here is really significant, right? Because it also becomes a vehicle for a lot of conversations around the case involving Russian collusion, right? And the Mueller investigation into Russian interference in the elections. But again, another hero in that narrative is Michael Flynn himself. And so there are a lot of sort of theories, some of them are conspiracy theories, okay, about whether or not, Flynn or others in his ambit, and even the White House itself, the Trump White House, in some way coordinated a lot of the messaging that we saw on 8chan and then later 8kun about QAnon.
Yeah, right. I'm wondering though, this, thinking back to what David said about this idea that the elites will often sort of use the term conspiracy theory about particular world building projects to sort of denigrate them, right? To make them less than. And what's striking in this instance with QAnon is the desire on the part of the media to often call it a religion. And I wonder what that tells us about the relationship between religion and conspiratorial thought within, especially in the American public consciousness.
It does depend on the context. The US context, the British context are going to be slightly different here because Britain's a lot more secular. But the such and such is a religion can do one of two things. It can either identify something as being irrational, which is what British press is more likely to do. And in the US, it's much more likely to be, to suggest kind of blind obedience. It's more like harking back to Cold War rhetoric about the Soviet Union or the Chinese or something like that, right? Where it's or they do what they're told. It's all dogma, right? The kind of way that some people in the conspiratorial world talk about the Catholic Church. It's the one leader says something and everybody else does it, and they don't think about it. They just do the dogma. So they do slightly different things, and you've got to watch who's saying it. If it's coming from Richard Dawkins, that means something quite different than if it's coming from someone who's, much more prominent in a faith community. What was interesting was how often it happened in, the 2016 election campaign on both sides. And then there are still, like only 2 days ago, I was joking with some friends on Twitter about some right-wing guys from the US had circulated a chart on how wokeness is the new religion, and it had a breakdown by dogma and rituals and all these kind of things. So it sort of did underline that what Candace was kind of referring to, where this it became very tribal. It was an unusually polarized election. And we saw exactly the same in Britain, actually, around the Brexit campaign, that both sides were sort of denigrating each other as being mindless, because obviously both sides, if you ask them, they have good reasons. The other side don't agree with them. Therefore, there must be something wrong. They must not be understanding the reasons properly, right? So either they don't understand them, like they don't have the education, they don't have the common sense, or they've been brainwashed by education to think something different, or they're just doing what they're told and they're not thinking about the reasons. They're doing it because that's their religion. They just go along with it. And that's kind of what these discourses do. What there's a more interesting recent development of that I'll come back to later on, because I think it's more relevant to the end of the conversation. But the discourse on what is and isn't a cult is also relevant here, because of course a religion is something you are allowed to think. A cult isn't.
Absolutely.
This is a question that I wasn't sure I was going to ask. I wanted to see how this conversation went, but I think the conversation has gone in a way that I find it I find it really on my mind. And the question, put quite simply, is what is a scholar's duty to the truth? And let me unpack that a little bit. On the one hand, I think we've made a number of very salient observations in terms of the need to complicate these terms, to think about what we call conspiracy theory as, we've heard the term subaltern epistemologies, thinking through the role of different kinds of power arrangements as to what counts as truth, what doesn't. Clearly, scholars have an obligation in our work to continue to complicate and nuance those narratives. On the other hand, I think for a variety of reasons, many of us are in institutions that also understand the obligations to the truth in a different way, which is when there is misinformation out there, and that misinformation is potentially harmful or demonstrably harmful, then scholars have the obligation to assert the truth over and against this harm. And so I'm wondering if we think those two duties to truth are ever in tension. That is, the duty to continue to complicate the narrative and point out the different nuances on the one hand, or on the other hand, the duty to say there is clear misinformation that is causing harm, and whether it's in a sort of enlightenment mode of verification and falsifiability, we just sort of need to assert the truth before more people get hurt. Are those modes in tension? Do they fit together? How do we think about scholarship in relation to that? Candace, can we start with you?
Gosh, that's a really complicated question. I'm not certain I have a great answer, except as you were talking, I was thinking, so if we're talking about what is our duty and service to the truth as scholars, which truth? In the context of misinformation and disinformation, you could ask the question around the factuality of claims, or you could ask the question around the dynamics of communication of power, right? So, again, just coming back to the online example, I mean, you can use it in other contexts, right? I mean, I certainly think, I'm not to open a can of worms, but like this recent national debate around the degree to which critical race theory has entered school curricula in the K through 12 level. Okay, we can get into that. We don't even get into it on the university level, but just the K through 12 level in public schools. But so the question is, if we're talking about misinformation and disinformation as a phenomenon and a dynamic, and the duty is not to the factuality of the claims in an information environment. It's actually to understanding the systems that make those claims resonant with certain communities, right? And I mean that on a couple of different levels. So there are the technological systems in the context of social media, for instance, excuse me, that we as scholars have a duty to understand and research their impact and their capabilities on these types of questions. There is then the kind of institutional view, for instance, members of Congress or local officials or authorities of some sort who are in a position of power. How do we understand their mandates and provisions in terms of protecting a collective and consensus view that has been agreed upon in law, for instance. Not just normative, but literally sort of in a sort of very concrete way. These actions may result in certain types of harms or injuries, right? So when we're talking about it in that sense, as scholars, I think there's a range of action that is available to us to influence the conversation and to influence the scholarship and to understand the idea of truth generally. But when we're talking about trying to push back on, factual claims that are counterfactual, I'm not certain it's a good use of energy. I'm not certain that it's going to be a winning line of strategy. Even in the context of institutional politics, let's take a university as an example. I will name no universities here. I will simply say that we know that this debate over the story of America and power and race has been extremely complicated, at least since the appearance of the 1619 Project that the New York Times put together, okay? And that it is a galvanizing force in our national conversation about belief. And that's an example where you may not win if your strategy as a scholar is to confront that as a moment to tell the truth.
Mhm.
Yeah, Candice has said most of what I wanted to say, but she's said it better than I would have, so that's good. Yeah, obviously when you're working in a field, when you're working with, conspiracy theorists, members of minority religions, people who feel excluded, or in some cases are excluded from certain avenues and being heard, you do develop a sort of a way of boxing kind of your own opinions off. You wouldn't get too far in the study of comparative religion if you couldn't do that. But that doesn't mean ignoring historical truths or, ignoring that, a text says something or that something can be proven that to have happened. But in terms of, capital T truth, we still haven't been able to expose incredibly simple truths like the history of your nation and mine, and in our involvement in genocide, and the fact that certain colors or genders of people don't have full rights. These are and we're not going to win that argument just by telling people that they're wrong. What we do is we look at the way that these terms work in society, the work they do, because often the way that they obscure power, right? It takes this unpicking, this relentless sort of, it seems like nitpicking, but it's not. It's getting to what these things are hiding, the power relations, and that they're hiding. That I see my duty as more to expose those power relations as to certainly to tell one particular truth. Put it that way.
I have to agree with you, David, because, as an anthropologist in the field, when you're talking to someone about, an election and they're giving you completely inaccurate facts, your first inclination is to push back and say, no, that's not the truth. This is what actually happened, right? But if you just listen to the logics of it, right, and you have a conversation about it, it actually does more good in the end, I think, because it allows those power dynamics, as you mentioned, to come forth, and it reveals more than if we just sort of in a reactionary way said, no, that's not the truth. Right.
Can I pick up on something? There was something at the beginning. I think it was Rob, you said when you were talking about misinformation and disinformation. Actually, maybe it was you, Candice. But I just wanted to unpick those because they're not the same thing. We often talk about them as if they're the same thing. But I mean, misinformation is just being wrong. And disinformation is lying. Those are different things. And so when people, I think there's a tendency for, especially for governments, I think the way that people are talking about Facebook and so on at the moment, to sort of blame the users. But if you think about something like, people will share things that are wrong, okay, but we need to look at something like Fox News or Cambridge Analytica or something. These are people who are deliberately disseminating incorrect information on purpose for political gain, and they're paying a lot of money to do it, and they're paying off governments to do it. And so disinformation and the kind of an incorrect fact that somebody's sharing on Facebook is less the issue, I think, than finding out who these powers are that are paying for this stuff, and how they've been allowed to get to a situation where they can dominate the media quite as much as they are.
David, I'm going to challenge you on one, the conspiracy theory I hear embedded in that logic. I think it's actually, so it's kind of interesting. So I think you're right that misinformation is the unintentional communication and spread of false information, either through a misunderstanding, right? Or a kind of missed set of facts, sort of an incomplete picture is somehow being delivered to the audience intended, right? But there is an intention, and there's quite a lot of intentionality in spreading, for instance, COVID misinformation, in the sense that you're being part of a community. So coming back again to this idea of agency, right? Like you can be on Facebook in a parents group and have all kinds of ideas about whether ivermectin will be useful to give to your children so they can get back to school. And that's, that's a certain, but there's an intentionality there, right? Which is like joining the community that embraces the idea of playing around with theorizing about what harm is not. Disinformation is not necessarily lying. It can be also, and this is a subtle difference, deception. And there's, kind of, which is showing the false and hiding the real, right? Which is, Barton Whaley, who's a theorist of deception tactics in military strategy, has spent his lifetime talking about this, and in fact studying magicians and how they use showing the false and hiding the real as a technique to give illusion. So and you need not be a government actor in order to do that, right? Or to use that as a strategy for achieving your aims, which may or may not be political. Sometimes they're profit driven. Sometimes they're power driven. Sometimes they're status driven. So I think we often think of, right now, we're in this kind of mold of like China and Russia, they do propaganda. We're learning now, of course, that France also apparently does, and probably the US does as well. But I think a much more subtler kind of approach to kind of defining these terms kind of lays out this idea that the real intent with disinformation is deception.
I think that's a really important place to stop, because we have some questions piling up in the chat. We want to get to those before the end of the hour. I know there's so much more we could talk about, right?
Just got started, really.
Oh, that we had another hour, David. All right. And for those of you who haven't already submitted, please submit your questions now in hopes that we can get to those before the end of the hour. I'm going to start off with one that I think is really interesting from an anonymous attendee. Who says, regarding conspiracy theory through the lens of disenfranchisement versus hegemony, what do we make of politicians co-opting language around COVID conspiracies? And they also would love to hear each of your favorite conspiracy theories.
And you get to define what favorite means,
Yes.
and on what basis. So the theory and the rationale, that's all you.
David,
Okay.
you want to take a whack?
Okay. Yeah, so there are certain politicians who will deliberately adopt the sort of language of conspiracy theories, it's still subaltern, but because they tend to be populists for whom the rejection and challenge of elites is part of their appeal. So, you know, Trump and Johnson, even though he's a public school boy, and you know, Bolsonaro and these kind of people. It's quite it's a way of speaking the language of the people, and also, you know, presenting a critique which you know, has the same appeal coming from the mouth of a politician as it does coming from someone you know, at the pub or on Facebook or whatever, that, you know, here's the real truth, you're in the know now. Favorite conspiracy theories, I mean, in terms of what my favorite, historically speaking, is satanic ritual abuse, because I think almost everything goes back to satanic ritual abuse, including QAnon. I never stop harping on about it, because it was government policy. Police were trained in it. It was the truth for about 10 years. And now it's, you know, a large section of QAnon, especially outside of the US, where the Trump stuff's not quite as important. But my all-time favorite is the one, I think it comes from the 5% Nation of Islam. I heard it from the ODB that it's actually 1979, and that the white people stole several decades from the black people to keep them as part of their enslavement, which I love that. It's I've never heard anybody else come out with that. I'd like to know if there's like a book explaining it in more detail.
That's a pretty good one. Yeah, boy, I don't know if I have any favorites.
You don't have to. It's not a requirement.
But I mean, it is important to talk about sort of, you know, indeed, like politicians and their adoption of conspiracy theory rhetoric, right, as a tool for mobilizing their constituents. People would say mobilizing their base. I'm not certain that's always the case. Sometimes it's also to try and kind of build on an existing base as well. I think that's right, that implicit in the adoption of conspiracy theory lens and rhetoric from a political point of view, especially if you're sort of a politician who's either elected or trying to be elected, or if you're just seeking a leadership position, right, either by default or design. It's critical that you are seen in this lens as part of the movement, but not trying to lead it, because that would make you an elite, right? And so there's this kind of very interesting dance that goes on, and this is a core, I think, feature of course populism itself, is that I mean, it's no coincidence that a lot of populists, with a couple of exceptions, like Adolf Hitler, you know, are rich guys. You don't see a lot of really super wealthy, powerful women, you know, kind of trying to adopt this mantle in a successful way. Increasingly, more and more in U.S. politics, you see types of, you know, of elected officials trying to grab onto that, women in particular. But interestingly, when you weigh out their impact, I mean, if you see also somehow the mainstream media treats the difference between, say, I will name names here, a Paul Gosar and a Marjorie Taylor Greene as an example, to, you know, QAnon devotees who clearly share a worldview and are part of this world building project known as QAnon. You know, Gosar is treated as a true threat, so much so that he's censured, right? So there's an expression of power there. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has also done some pretty controversial things, is kind of dismissed as kind of a kook, right? So I mean, there is an interesting gendered piece also, I think, to the rhetoric of conspiracy theories. And I think, as David just pointed out, in our country, at least in the United States, and I think in other places where you have an Anglican or an English influence, and there's this kind of division between the brown, the black, and the white that is very clear and bound up in history. There are lots of mirrors in that hallway, and they're all mostly broken, and they reflect a very, very dark vision of the human enterprise.
There are a number of questions in the chat, and I think this will be sort of a synthetic question since I know we're coming up on our time. A number of folks who have joined us today are very appreciative, Candace, of the way you've just asked the question of resonance, what resonates. I think, David, some of your questions about the analogs between religious belief and the rhetorical function of what we call conspiracy. And I guess as a way of tying all that together, I'll ask the more general question. Where do you think study of conspiracy theory, maybe particularly in relation to religion, but also more generally, where does it need to go from here? What are the questions that we need to be asking in order to keep this field, keep this line of inquiry headed in the kind of promising directions that several of you have articulated?
Can I go first, Candace?
Yeah, no, you go first, after you.
Okay. So the line of argument, I've circled around it a few times about really, we need to move away from our polemic or sort of binary way of looking at, you know, what actually are conspiracies and what do we do about these dangerous things, and move to looking at the terms that the work that these terms do in the public sphere. I think we're living at a really, really interesting time where a lot of hegemonies are beginning, if not to collapse, the cracks are showing a little, and we have a kind of opportunity to stick some wedges in there and really expose some power dynamics that are going on to do with, you know, with knowledge. Post-truth is not only an age in which the irrational has become deified. It's the end of capital T, the one truth that a certain section of humans gets to tell everyone else is reality. We're entering a much more pluralistic age. And so scholarship needs to, you know, move away from polarized models of thinking about these things, and instead look at social epistemology of you know, how knowledge is created, how knowledge is reinforced, how it's mystified, how it's distributed, and not only in terms of religions, conspiracy theories, but also, you know, like indigenous people and all sorts of people who haven't really had a voice. We need to think completely differently about the way that knowledge is constructed. That's where I hope it's going. I don't know if we'll be there until the political situation calms down a little bit, because we all have a great deal of personal things at stake at the moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I was going to say that part of that movement in that direction, David, and I think, you know, is that somehow I think the media of all kinds, okay, mainstream, television, print, social media, are going to have to do a lot of work and learning around the pluralistic sine waves of technological change, right, in human history.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think you're right. We are in a pluralistic age, but it's not the first time we're in a pluralistic age. Coming back to this idea that, you know, when humans find themselves collectively imperiled by a shift in our environment, literally our physical environment, that then forces an adaptation in terms of our creation and use of technology. We often see the emergence of apocalyptic, right, thinking, as well as you know, counterfactual and sort of pluralistic blooming, you know, about sort of ideas and knowledge and power. But to your point on the kind of crumbling or collapsing of or erosion of hegemonies, I do think there's something very special in this historical moment that is unique, that isn't just about, you can't boil it down to one or two or three movements, right? It's but they are movements that are occurring, not just ideas being transferred on some sort of platform or even in a book form or what are sort of standard means of communicating. Movements of people, social movements are emerging from this collapse of multiple hegemonies.
Mhm. Yeah, I quite agree. Things which have formerly been thought of as separate things,
Right.
it's like starting to dissolve a little bit.
And on that note, friends, I have the terrible, terrible job of noticing that our hour has come to a close. This conversation has just been remarkably rich. And Candace and David, on behalf of Sarah and myself, I just want to thank you so much for being with us during this time. And thank you to everyone too who joined us, everyone who asked questions. As you're seeing, I think on the screen, you have an opportunity, and it would be a big help to the center if you would go ahead and take just a few minutes and fill out a short survey. It's there in the chat, and then you'll also receive a link via email. In just a few short weeks, on December 9th, the next episode of Religion And will be on the subject of religion and the Supreme Court. So be sure to join or tune in on December 9th. And then within about a week or so, if you'd like to revisit this conversation, I know I will be, that link will be available on the center's YouTube page as well. Thank you so much for joining us, friends.
Thank you so much, Candace and David, and thank you to everyone who stayed with us during this really, really engrossing hour. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really great speaking to everyone.